it's been well over a year and over 30 videos later, we're now back here at the battlefield of Sedgemoor. In those 30 plus videos, we have followed the life and times of James Scott, Duke of Monmouth. From his birth in exiled Holland to the future Charles II, we followed him as he grew up in the royal court to become the commander-in-chief of the English army. He was the people's champion, the royal favourite, but eventually brought down by religion, politics, the greed of men, and his own vanity. Now, Monmouth is trapped in nearby Bridgewater, with his enemy, the red-coated royal army of his uncle, King James II, encamped near the village of Weston Zoyland, just over there. They're encamped just behind a drainage ditch called the Bussex Ring. We'll be hearing more of that very soon. Monmouth is out of options. He cannot stay entrenched in Bridgewater. The royal army is getting stronger and stronger every day. He cannot retreat further into the West Country. That will mean more desertions from his army and his eventual destruction. He cannot attack. The royal army is too superior in cavalry and artillery. He cannot break free. The enemy army is just too close. Monmouth has just one option, a night attack. Every option, every choice has led to this moment, the battlefield of Sedgemoor. It's his last throw of the dice, and if he fails, it'll be the end of Monmouth. Let's see how it goes.
So what was the situation as the sun was going down on the 5th of July, 1685? The rebel army was much reduced by desertions and the distribution of the king's royal pardon to anyone who returned home immediately. Morale was shaky due to the continuous retreat from Bristol and the constant skirmishing with the ever-growing strength of the royal army. Unless a miracle happened, they surely would be doomed. But now, with their leader once more animated by the chance of action, instilled a fighting spirit back into his men. Soon, the plan was put into action, and Bridgewater became a hive of frantic activity. Weapons were sharpened, muskets were cleaned, powder flasks and bandoliers filled, and any lead that could be found melted down for musket balls. The Duke's fledgling artillery train was to cause some initial troubles. One cannon had to be left behind due to a squeaky wheel that could not be muffled. All the others and wagons had their axles greased, and all the cavalry's harnesses and traces were tied down to ensure no noise would be emitted. The foot soldiers were also given strict orders to maintain absolute silence on the march. In particular, special care was given to the bandoliers of the musketeers. On a normal march, they would make an awful lot of noise, but now they had to be tied down. Matchlock musketeers would also have to keep the glow from their match hidden from any passing royal patrols. They had some options. Either only have one man in 10 to have their match lit, to reduce the amount of light giving off by the marching men, or have the musketeers use a match protector to keep the glow hidden, but at the same time keep it dry and able to breathe. However, the men were given a darker order still. There was to be absolute silence on the march. Any man making a noise should be clubbed or stabbed by the man behind. Not quite the same as Roman decimation, but still pretty brutal. Brutal, but the safety of all the men was at stake, not to mention the success of the whole rebellion. So with the men, horses and artillery ready, this was the plan. Using Godfrey, the local lad and shepherd, as a guide, the rebel army would march after dark. They would leave all the unnecessary wagons on the Bristol road. If these were spotted by royal patrols, it would hopefully alert the enemy that Monmouth would be planning on another attempt on Bristol. Monmouth would not attack the royal camp by the direct route across the moor. This was the shortest and easiest route, but also the most obvious. If he did attack this way, the first thing he would stumble into would be the royal guns positioned to protect the royal camp from his direction. Despite being in the dark, having difficult terrain to cross with treacherous, deep and water-filled ditches to avoid, and the need to avoid royal patrols, Monmouth would take a long and circuitous route. This plan would be less obvious to the enemy, but more open to being spotted. The rebels would march along the causeway, brush the bottom of the Poldon Hills, skirt the village of Bordrip, and then turn right. They would then march to the west of the Black Ditch, cross the Langmoor Reen by the Langmoor Stones, and then once onto the open moor, form up for battle. Now just a quick mention of the Reens, those great drainage ditches which still criss-cross the moor even to this day. Some were very broad, some were very deep, whilst others were narrower and more fordable. But all would have a bottom of thick, glutinous and treacherous mud, not ideal in keeping close military formations together. And their crossing points, or plungeons, again, these were not designed for the passage of large bodies of men and animals. These were simply narrow strips of land which would allow herdsmen and sheep across. The reens and the plungeons in the dark would spell disaster for the rebel cause. But back to the march. The rebel columns must have been a riot of colour. What with the regimental colours, the banners given to Monmouth from the schoolgirls of Taunton, the red-coated Somerset militia who had deserted their royal master at Axminster, and of course the men of Monmouth's Red Regiment, clothed in regal purple coats with red facings. The snaking rebel column must have stretched back several hundred metres. Once they closed on the Bussex Reen, which Monmouth was aware of and had ordered makeshift bridges to be built, the plan was more of a hit and run rather than a full-pitched battle, trading lead with the enemy. Monmouth had decided the main blow would be from the cavalry. Lord Grey, in charge of the horse, would get across the upper plungeon, one of the land bridges which crossed the Reens, get in amongst the infantry, hacking at tent ropes, striking down men as they stumbled out of the tents, and then charge into Weston-Zoyland, cut horses, ropes, and cause utter confusion. In Monmouth's words, it seemed too simple. He said, "Why, gentlemen, we shall have no more to do than lock up their stable doors and seize the troopers in their beds." The rebel foot and artillery, still out on the moor, would by then close with the Bussex Reen and provide covering fire and help the rebel horse pull out after their work had been done. Hopefully, the rebel horse would cause such devastation and chaos in the redcoat ranks that it would offer Monmouth enough breathing space to break free from the Royal Army. He could then again attempt Bristol or get behind Feversham and head for London. For a rebel army, despite its experienced officers and NCOs, and despite its previous triumphs over the Royal Army, this coordinated big night attack was still a huge ask. So that was Monmouth's plan, but what was his enemy thinking that night? The Royal Army and its commanders were confident, but still watchful. After all, it was still only a matter of days since the rebels had checked the Royal Army at Phillips Norton, giving them an embarrassing bloody nose in the process. The enemy were now so close, pretty much trapped, and the Royal Army was still expecting more reinforcements, including some seriously big guns from London. Reinforcements were indeed important, because on the eve of the Battle of Sedgemoor, the forces were pretty evenly balanced. The Duke had about 4,000 men, 4 squadrons of horse, and 3 light cannon, one which was abandoned due to the squeaky wheel. The Royal Army, on the other hand, had 3,600 men, 5 squadrons of horse, and 18 light field guns. The Royal Army was concentrated, but dispersed. The foot, 6 regular and veteran units were encamped just back from the Bussex Reen, a drainage ditch that would cause insurmountable problems later on. The guns were well away from the infantry guarding the Bridgewater Road, and the cavalry stabled in the village of Weston-Zoyland. Close, but were they close enough? The Royal Foot regiments were lined from east to west. Dunbarton's, or the Royal Scots, followed by the 1st Foot Guards, then the 2nd Foot Guards, and then Trelawney's and Kirk's regiments. To the west of all these units was the combined Grenadier formation. Every regiment was formed up with military precision. Every soldier was in a tent, lined in the correct company, and alongside his NCOs and officers. In the case of an alarm, they could stumble out of their tent and straight into the arms of a sergeant who could rapidly shove them into position. It would be a matter of minutes for the Royal Army to form up. For Monmouth, this would spell disaster. On top of this efficient layout, one man in the Royal Scots was one step ahead of everyone else. This was one Captain Mackintosh. He believed, and indeed laid a bet, that the rebels would indeed attack that very night. It is recorded that he laid out lines running from the men's tents towards the Bussex Reen. This would act as a guide if the men were called out in the middle of the night. These lines would prove incredibly useful. In addition to the foot regiments encamped on the moor, the artillery guarding the Bridgewater Road and the cavalry stabled in Weston-Zoyland, there were plentiful militia units resting up in nearby Middlezoy. Now for centuries, the overall royalist commander, Louis de Raa, Earl of Feversham, has been criticised for his lacklustre defensive measures leading up to the battle. Many historians have in fact vilified him, saying he was woefully unprofessional, and the hard work done and laurels should go to his deputy John Churchill, the future Duke of Marlborough. But is this justified? We will cover this topic in our Monmouth Myths video at a later date. But what exactly did Feversham do? To cover the area to the front of his encampment, the commander placed a unit of musketeers in Pensy Pound to guard the main route into Western Zoyland. Captain Upcott had a mounted guard covering Fowler's Plot, and Major Compton, with a considerable cavalry force, guarded the eastern flank. On top of this, Feversham's favourite, Colonel Oglethorpe, was ordered to make an expansive recce of all the paths that led north to Bristol. Not content with just sending his men out into the dark, along with Ramsay, he went out himself and checked all his sentries and vedettes. Finally, having checked that all was quiet and no sign of any enemy attacks, around 1 in the morning, he finally went to bed. It seems clear that Feversham, without keeping the whole army awake all night, had done enough to spot any enemy action during the night. The rebels in the dead of night marched. They could not take a diagonal route either across the moor. Monmouth knew there were many royalist sympathisers in Baldrip and Chedsey, and could not risk them raising the alarm. They must take the circuitous route around both, get to the infamous Black Ditch, and then take a hard turn to the right. Things seemed to be going well. The men were tense yet cheerful, and every step they took which was not spotted only increased their morale. Suddenly, the column came to a shuddering halt. Men skidded, equipment, even though tied down, rattled. Horses breathed noisily and nervously. They knew there was danger on the night air. But what had caused that panicked halt? Just across the Black Ditch, a forbidding dark stretch of water, came the clank of harnesses, the soft pattering of hooves, the grunts of horses, and muted voices of enemy horsemen. The men at the front of the rebel column peered terrified through the mist, and could just make out the shadowy, wraith-like images of royal cavalry. It is all too easy to imagine the fear of the rebel soldiers, who stood statue-like, not daring to breathe, let alone move. As the royal horsemen slowly passed, all it would take was a cough, someone falling, a neigh from a skittish horse, and they would be rumbled. Minutes passed, which must have seemed like hours, but eventually, slowly, very slowly, the enemy horse disappeared into the night. These horsemen were moving up towards the Polden Hills, and believed to be under the direct command of Colonel Oglethorpe. Making doubly sure the cavalry had gone, whispered orders went down the column, and soon the rebels were marching towards their next checkpoint, the Langmoor Stones, a useful navigational aid showing the crossing point over the Langmoor Reen. Once over, it would be a straight dash towards the Bussex Reen and their enemy. The battle and rebel success was still on. Despite the terrain, the pitch-black night, the treacherous drainage ditches, and the nervous horses and men, the march was going very well. It was a sign of Monmouth's leadership and the discipline of the rebel army that they had got this far without being rumbled. Everything on the moor was peaceful, dark, and without a sound. And now the Langmoor Reen had been reached. Victory was in sight. A gunshot shattered the still night like a thunderclap. The noise reverberated as a sharp amber explosion tore the night sky apart. They had been spotted by an enemy patrol, a vedette, a cavalry patrol. Everything had changed in a flash. Who fired this fatal shot? Legend has it was a traitor's hand that pulled the trigger, and we will be discussing this further in our Monmouth Myths video. But most historians agree it was from a royalist patrol on spotting the rebel advance. No matter who fired the gun, one thing was clear: the race was on. Monmouth had to get to the royal camp before the redcoats could get formed up and ready for battle. If they were late, Monmouth and his men would be doomed. Battle, however, was soon to be joined as Monmouth grabbed hold of Lord Grey and ordered him to charge his horse forward, get in amongst the royal tents, cut guide ropes, cut horses' bridles, and cause havoc, whilst Monmouth himself brought up the foot and the guns. Captain Hooker, with his own squadron of horse, galloped forward into the darkness and was immediately attacked in the flank. This initial clash was brutal, bloody, and brief. The commander of the royalist squadron, Major Compton, was wounded, but despite this, the rebel horse, many not used to combat and especially fighting against large and well-trained war horses, broke and fled. To make matters worse, the shattered and panicking horses bolted back where they had come from and straight back into Grey's advancing horse. Time was already ticking for Monmouth, who was still over 1.5 miles away from the royal camp and still had the Bussex Reen to get over. The cavalry trooper who had first raised the alarm by now had made it back to the camp and tore through the sleeping ranks. Galloping at breakneck speed, he roared at the top of his lungs, "Beat your drums, the enemy has come! For the Lord's sake, beat your drums!" This is where the Royal Army, having just been supplied with their new campaign tents, held the advantage. The foot regiments were concentrated, all together, by battalion, by company. As soon as the panicked trooper tore through the camp with his warning, men fell out of their tents, into the arms of their NCOs, and shoved into the line. They may be tired, unnerved, half-dressed and cold, but before long, pikes would be ready and matches lit. Monmouth, still out on the moor, urged his men across the Langmoor Reen, had less than half an hour, for by now the Royal Cavalry in Western Zoyland was beginning to hear the alarm. It would take longer to get ready than the infantry in the dark, as they had to find their horses and get mounted. Lord Grey, managing to free his command from the chaos behind him, had finally reached the Bussex Reen. But luck was again going to serve Monmouth false. Grey could not find the upper plungeon, the land bridge which allowed access over the drainage ditches. Instead of turning left, he took the fatal turn to the right. He soon came opposite Dumbarton's regiment, or the Royal Scots, who were forming up behind the Reen. A challenge rang out from the Scots. "Who are you for?" One of Grey's horsemen, using his initiative, replied back, "The Duke of Albemarle's horse." With this reply seemingly satisfactory, Lord Grey and his horsemen were allowed to pass. But the next royal regiment were less easy to fool. This was the 1st Foot Guards. "Who are you for?" shouted Captain Berkeley as the shadowy horseman loomed into view. "The King," came the answer. "What King?" "Monmouth, and God is with us," was the angry reply. "Take this with you." Berkeley ordered his men to give fire, which they did with great execution. More battalions fired on the rebel cavalry. These volleys emptied saddles, hit horses, and killed many. The majority of Monmouth's cavalry had been neutralised with just a handful of well-aimed volleys. While the Royal Army poured lead into the rebel cavalry, Monmouth, still further back on the moor, was ordering his men to double time their way forward. This task was not made easy by the fleeing horses from Hooker's broken squadron. The traffic jam on the Langmoor Reen had wasted a lot of the precious time. It was not until 2:30 before Monmouth's foot regiments were beginning to turn from column of march to line of battle. It is said in the dark they navigated their way towards the royal lines by the glow of the burning matches of Dumbarton's musketeers. Here is another legend of the battle which was repeated almost in every history of the period. Again, we will be delving into this subject in our Monmouth Myths video. As the regiment struggled to get to the Bussex Reen after the debacle of forcing their way through panicking cavalry, one Captain Jones was performing heroics on the left flank. This cavalry commander had managed to pull the remnants of a cavalry force together and advanced on the royalist shaky and still open right flank. The upper plungeon was very close. They could still get across and outflank the redcoats. But on the right flank, Lord Grey, true to form, was not having the best of luck. After losing many men and horses to royalist muskets, Lord Grey had not given up hope in finding a crossing of the Bussex Reen. After much searching in the dark, they finally located the lower plungeon, but by now it was guarded, and guarded by the hardened veterans of Tangier, Kirk's Lambs. With these fearsome soldiers guarding the lower plungeon, more royalist activity was going on. Feversham, now awake and on the field, had ordered up his artillery, which had been covering the main road to Bridgewater. But unbeknown to the commander, the great guns were having their own problems. In the darkness and confusion, and perhaps because the way the army had been dissipated, the horses to drag the guns could not be found. But help was on hand, and help from on high. Peter Muse, the Bishop of Winchester, is the real unsung hero of the Royalist cause. His actions on the night of Sedgemoor were described centuries later by Winston Churchill with the words, "In the tradition of the church militant here on earth." According to the Eclectic magazine, Muse exceedingly loved fighting, and having had a military education, prided himself on his skill as a bombardier. He served in the Royal Army as a volunteer, and soon discerned that the crisis of the engagement had arrived, which was to be settled not with small shot, but with heavy pieces. He promptly ordered his horses to be taken from his carriage to bring the royal cannons into position from the Bridgewater road. Like Julius II at Mirandola, this warlike divine then opened and superintended the battery. His discharges, scientifically directed, mowed down his antagonists by scores. The famous historian Macaulay states the following about the Royalist artillery at Sedgemoor. So defective were then the appointments of an English army, that there would not have been much difficulty in dragging the great guns to the place where the battle was raging, had not the Bishop of Winchester offered his coach and horses and traces for the purpose. However, this was not the last scandalous indictment of the professionalism of the royal guns that night, for when the guns did arrive, there was such a lack of gunners that a sergeant of Dumbarton's regiment, named Weems, was forced to take on himself the management of several pieces, and for which he received a gratuity of £40 for good service in the action at Sedgemoor in firing the great guns at the rebels. With the guns finally on the move, Feversham had also ordered the Grenadier Battalion into action as well. But the real danger to the royal position, which Monmouth would not have been able to comprehend, was how the rebel regiments were actually joining the battle. As musket fire and cannon fire tore back and forth across the Bussex Green, more and more regiments were forming up to the left of the line, slowly overlapping the royal position. With Dumbarton's and the Foot Guards being shredded by the Duke's artillery, the royal position was still very vulnerable. If Monmouth could get his foot regiments moving forwards, get across the problematic upper plungin, they could outflank the redcoats and still win the day. But despite his protestations and personal presence, Monmouth could not persuade, cajole or entice his men forward. The volume of musketry and the unknown depths of the Bussex Green kept the rebels motionless. With the rebels struggling to move, the royalists were far from static. Now perhaps seeing the danger of being outflanked, dragoons were ordered to move from the royal left to the right flank to plug the gap, whilst heavier units were redeployed. This was desperately needed as Captain Jones, remember him? Our hero on the left flank, was now attacking royalist cavalry on the upper plungin and was pushing them back. The lower plungin was the scene of a desperate battle now as well. Oglethorpe, who we last talked about, as he missed the whole of the rebel army marching past him earlier in the night, was back in action. As Lord Grey was battling with Kirk's lambs on the lower plungin, Oglethorpe hit the rebel cavalry in the rear. Attacked from both sides, the rebel horse had had enough and fled. In the middle of the battle, musketry and cannon roared back and forth, with neither side wanting to force the crossing of the Bussex Green. But for the time being, on the Duke's left, Captain Jones was pushing his attacks hard. This cavalry clash coincided with Colonel Brandt bringing his fearsome Scythe Battalion to the left of the line, once more overlapping the royal line. It was still a precarious time for Feversham and the Redcoats. If the other two rebel regiments could arrive quickly, they could still carry the day. But Feversham and the Royal Army were beginning to prepare the counter-attack. To bolster the failing right flank, Oglethorpe, after his defeat of Grey, was ordered to the opposite side. On top of this, the royal guns had been finally repositioned and now were firing into the packed rebel lines. With the fire raging to new intensities and regiments on both sides of the Rhine repositioning in the dark, the rebels were beginning to run out of ammunition. The tough decision to leave all those barrels of gunpowder on the beaches of Lyme Regis must have weighed very heavy on Monmouth's officers at this time. With musketry, cannon firing and cavalry clashes across the battlefield, the scales were slowly tipping in the Royalists' favour. Having dispersed Grey's horse by the lower Plungeon, Oglethorpe gathered his troopers and moved them across behind the Royal Foot to take on Jones's squadron on the opposite flank. On top of this, seeing the main fight was on the Royalist right, Kirk's Lambs, after seeing off Lord Grey's cavalry, also moved to the right of Dumbarton's, again strengthening the tottering right flank. With Oglethorpe to the side and Kirk's to the front, the brave Jones finally gave way and succumbed to the overwhelming numbers. With the battle pivoting on the upper Plungeon, Lord Grey, after his recent defeat, had managed to find Monmouth amidst the gunsmoke and chaos. He would stay with Monmouth for the remainder of the battle. The battlefield, still in darkness, is in chaos, but Monmouth and his brave and loyal men are beginning to see the reality of their position. Many men have now run out of powder and musket balls, and the cries of "Powder! For God's sake, give us powder!" filled the battlefield. The rebel line began to buckle, but there was still brutal resistance to the royal attacks. Oglethorpe threw his cavalry at Brant's scythemen, who repulsed them with bloody losses. But all across the rebel line, the steady ranks were beginning to be whittled down by the constant fire from the royalist lines. By the time 4 o'clock rang out from the church at Chedsey, the battle was looking very grim for the rebel cause. Before too long, the sun would be coming up, which would allow Feversham to see the ragged state of the rebels and launch a full counterattack. But before long, the continued pressure was beginning to bite. The rebel right wing, still formed up and under orders, began a steady and measured fighting retreat. At the same time, however, the left wing, under huge amounts of pressure from horse and foot, completely broke and fled. Holmes's Green Regiment in particular was hardest hit under attack from Royal Horse and Dumbarton's regiment, who had managed to cross the Rhine. For too many rebel soldiers, it was now all for yourself, and flee as best you could. This was made all the harder as now militia horsemen had arrived at the battlefield and were keen to turn the rout into a massacre. With daylight starting to illuminate the sorry state of the battlefield, Feversham was now happy to advance more units to finish the job. Grenadiers crossed over to fire into the tightly packed regiments who were keeping the Royal Cavalry at bay. The rebels had lost the battle, but they were still fighting and still dangerous. Macaulay again describes the rebels' tenacity and how they were so often the equal of the supposed trained, professional and veteran Royal Cavalry. He wrote, "Yet his foot, though deserted, made a gallant stand. The Life Guards attacked them on the right, the Blues on the left. But these Somersetshire clowns, with their scythes and the butt ends of their muskets, faced the Royal Horse like old soldiers. Oglethorpe made a vigorous attempt to break them and was manfully repulsed. Sarsfield, a brave Irish officer, whose name afterwards obtained a melancholy celebrity, charged on the other flank. His men were beaten back. He was himself struck to the ground and lay for a time as one dead, but the struggle of the hardy rustics could not last. Yet despite their incredible bravery, the retreat was rapidly becoming a bloodbath. Matthews, Fuchs and Wade's regiment were conducting a hard-fought fighting retreat through the cornfields near Chedsey. Wade in particular with his regiment did sterling work, fighting off both grenadiers and horse grenadiers. But what of our hero, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth? He was seeing his hopes, his dreams, and perhaps his life ending right in front of his very eyes. He had not fled the battle early. He stayed until he knew there was no hope. I, for one, am in no doubt as to Monmouth's emotions at this time. His greatest regret, I am sure, would not be for his lost cause, or his future, which could only end with the axe, but the loss of life and suffering caused in his name. All those brave men who had dropped everything, risked everything, just to fight for him and his cause. I am sure that was what he regretted most at this time. So, what should he do? He had done all that he could. He had stood with his men, facing death alongside his scythesman and musketeer. Should he go down fighting, become a famous martyr on the field of Sedgemoor? After a difficult discussion with Grey, as terrified men poured back past him, the two men agreed they should run, and so they did. The sun was now up, and the scene below was ghastly. Wade was making his last stand in the lane back towards Bridgewater, and the moor was thick with redcoat soldiers, regular and militia cavalry. Feversham, though victorious, ordered a slow and steady and careful advance after the fleeing rebels, perhaps even now still worried about an ambush which would lead to unnecessary casualties. Confident of victory and seeing his cavalry sweeping all before his army, Feversham sent his favourite, Colonel Oglethorpe, to London to bring the king the great news of a royal victory. Churchill was to stay in Somerset to form a new brigade and advance to Bridgewater. It was indeed a bloody affair. The rebels suffered about 400 dead on the battlefield itself, and another 1,600 were captured in the immediate aftermath. 300 of these men were rounded up, bound, and placed inside St Mary's Church in Weston Zoyland. Many were to die of untreated wounds inside the church, whilst many were summarily hanged outside in the cemetery. The church and its surrounds must have been a scene of horror as redcoats, both regular and militia, vented their anger on their defeated opponents. The Royal Army, in contrast, suffered around 200 casualties, the majority of them from the Royal Scots and the Foot Guards, who were the targets of Monmouth's artillery throughout the battle. So, the rebel army and the cause of the Duke of Monmouth was shattered. The Royal Army's victory was complete. For Monmouth and his loyal and courageous followers, the next days, weeks, and months would only offer misery, hardship, deportation, slavery, and death. We really hope you've enjoyed and are still enjoying our now huge series on everything Duke of Monmouth. Our next video, though not continuing on from the Battle of Sedgemoor, will still be very much focused on 1685. We will be looking in fine detail at the musketeers of the Monmouth Rebellion and the Battle of Sedgemoor, both matchlock and flintlock, and of course we'll be firing my guns. After that, we'll be looking at the aftermath of the Monmouth Rebellion and the Battle of Sedgemoor. We will cover the capture of Monmouth himself, his grisly end, the people he left behind, and of course Judge Jeffreys and the bloody assizes. As always, thanks for watching.